that there is a group of issues, challenges, and problems the Islamists came across, and probably some dubbed the title of the first session, The Islamists and the Shock in Power. But were they shocked also or did they experience the same shock when they became in the opposition? And what are the challenges when they were in power? And having take into consideration that they were veteran and seasoned opposition. So those who are in opposition probably could have been faring better than those who found themselves all of a sudden in the driver's seat when they assumed power. Probably these are the questions and issues that we'll be addressing the panelists with. However, we start with the three important Arab models that explain the status of Islamists in the opposition rather than power, and also they represent three geographically adjacent countries in the region. The Syrian case by Dr. Abdurrahman Al-Haj, who's a Syrian academic and researcher, a renowned one for that matter. And he presented his view about the development of the Islamic movement after the Arab Spring. So what we're actually doing is actually revisiting that research area of interest, and also Mr. Shafiq Ishqir, a Lebanese distinguished researcher who has done a study about the Islamic group or Jama'ah Islamiyya in Lebanon and the transformation challenges, and Mr. Brahim Gharaibeh with a case study about the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, particularly in the recent years, with all the dialectics associated with this issue. And of course, we have three case studies represented by the three papers of the panelists, and we'll launch a discussion on these papers quickly. Then we'll try together to address and discuss the content therein later on. And personally, one of the primary impressions I came out with from the three sample and papers is the heavy burden of the external and regional onus on the three cases in Syria with the Salafi jihadist movement, the Iranian role, the regional role. So the Syrian presence, shadow presence, was also discernible in Lebanon and Palestine, and also the Jordanian shadow role or presence has been also discerned. So probably these are among the common issues between the three cases. That also there's an intergenerational conflict, internal crisis, and the dialectics of dealing with what's political and what is faith-based or da'wah-based. Let me start with Dr. Abdurrahman Al-Haj and his paper on the Syrian case. And it's quite clear, Dr. Abdurrahman, that the issue of sectarianism has really weighed down heavily on the Syrian case, as is the case with the Lebanese case. And of course, the internal workings weighed in heavily. So these extraordinary circumstances, did they prompt the Islamic factions and the Muslim Brotherhood to choose the path? So it was a compulsory and mandatory rather than by means of free choice to be set on those paths. Thank you indeed for this very difficult question indeed, because we cannot summarize the Salafi jihadi movements and the political Islamic movements and the Islamic groups or Jama'ahs who are da'wah based with their own different rationale and starting point. However, they have many things in common in the public action or the public space. The sectarian factor has been primary, that's for sure, and this is not new. It has always been the case a long time ago and started to be more visible after the coup d'etat led by Ba'ath Party back in 1963, and in 1964 the very first incidents in bombing a mosque in Hama, the first time in history in Syria, and this has prompted the establishment of a Salafi or jihadi based Islamic movement. Sheikh Marwan Hadid's group. And of course, it was on a progressive path and an upward trend infiltrated into a sectarian conflict. And of course, in the 1970s, the sectarianism has been well established in Syria, unfortunately, and also the beneficiary from the sectarian atmosphere were the Muslim Brotherhood, or probably they're the most who benefited, the most important group who benefited the most. And also, they left them with one option vis-a-vis a political regime and authority who's discreetly going about implementing their policies. And of course, with the building up of pressure, this has prompted to an all-out open conflict in the 80s, and it was a very huge defeat for them. And then the iron fist came down heavily, and the hammer went down by the Syrian regime on the country. And of course, once again, involving the army to confront the people is happening again, politically in the past, but now against the people of Syria, but on the same the sectarian grounds. So it was sectarianism par excellence, and the sectarianization, if I might say, quote unquote, of the army. And however, within the Syrian case, we could say that there is an event, the revolution event is an event outside the horizon of sectarianism for various factors. However, sectarianism has been an important factor inter alia. So probably we have to wonder what is the sectarian role as one of the elements inter alia, many other elements or factors that are more influential in Syria, or even with regards to Islamic movements that were established in Syria that were found an enabling environment. And probably this should prompt us to raise another question about the organization and regulatory presence of those movements in Syria, about the sectarian role. It is visible, discernible, influential, not within the context of civil war, albeit it's a contentious terminology, but rather the escalation of the hostilities between and the belligerent activities between the two parties to the conflict, because we had a national project which is the revolution for the Syrian democracy and freedom, which is actually in direct competition with the authority and the regime and the Islamists. And therefore, for both, the only way out or solution was to use sectarianism, because it's only their only way out, and to defy that national democratic scheme of the revolution. So to answer your question, were they forced into that path or not? I believe that it has been used voluntarily and on optional basis. They were not forced to it, but simply because they realized the innate benefits of the sectarianism, and they could have easily overcome it and overlooked it. It was an action and reaction. So they could have overcome it actually, but they intentionally chose it. Please go ahead, Dr. Muhammad. Dr. Muhammad? Yes, we can hear you. Well, my question, Dr. Abdurrahman, is that with regards to the other political Islam experiences, the democratic regimes should, or the democracy should have improved it further, or the post-political Islamic phase to become, rather than faith-based parties, but rather platform-based faiths. What about the regional and external climate? Did it really hinder the development of the Islamic groups in three cases, but in particular reference here to the Syrian case, and especially with what Ibrahim talks about, the identity-based questions? It could be weighing in and have a role. So to rephrase my question, I'd rather say, was there a potential possibility for the Brotherhood or the other Islamic movements, excluding the Salafi Jihadi, which is identity-based, did they have any possibility to introduce any different discourse, unlike what Shafiq talks about in Lebanon, is that there is an empathy between the identity and the faith-based or religious discourse? discourse. They became almost identical. Has it been settled already with revival movements such as the political Islamic movements? Well, to a certain extent, the sectarian issue was difficult for them to overcome and to disregard because actually the Islamic movements, they needed to conflict and go against it in the beginning because they suffered from it. And the Muslim Brotherhood in particular, because there are no other fully functional movements that we can talk of in Syria except for the Muslim Brotherhood. And they tried to renew and revamp their discourse prior to the Syrian revolution back in 2001, and they offered a national scheme or a project, as we call it. And probably we might disagree, but its discourse is pretty much similar to other national political parties that talk about freedom and democracy. And now, dramatic and key transformations in the political discourse of the Brotherhood did not happen as a result of the events in Syria. For instance, in 2013 or even 2015, I fail to recall now, they issued a compact or a charter for the Brotherhood, and it's very clear that they failed to introduce genuine transformations and radical changes. So the problem for the Brotherhood is not the political discourse, but rather in the implementation and the behavior and conduct therein. And if you want to read their discourse through their practices, you find that the sectarian corridor is a must for the Brotherhood from the historic legacy issue, and also because it's an important factor on the ground that cannot be overlooked. The second issue, the Syrian event, is a domestic one, even with the regional developments or the regional parties playing a role inside the Syrian event. The main actor, albeit, remained domestic powers. And of course, this will be a very quick interpretation of the matter. But at the end of the day, all of those inside even the regional powers are trying to adapt themselves to what is domestic, what is local, either to find a stronghold or a foothold, or to support certain movements, or to expand, such as the political Islamic organizations or movements. And I believe, in my personal point of view, that they were heavily and totally defeated after the war because they failed to deliver any discourse that is compatible with the current developments or in tandem with them, and failed to grasp the deep changes, and therefore in introducing a rift between the society's conscience and their organizations. So they missed the opportunity of introducing real change in the discourse, despite their certain attempts by certain movements is to do away with their heavy burden legacy of the Muslim Brotherhood. The only thing that we can talk about here and address is that the amalgam of those factors and elements that influence the Brotherhood, excluding the Salafi jihadi organizations or groups, we can say that yes, it is true that there were no genuine changes or impacts within their discourse, but the in-depth domestic perspective and put an end to the transborder for political Islamic organization Syria. Thank you very much, Abdurrahman. We'll be coming back to you again, but now we have to listen to Mr. Shafiq from Lebanon about the Jama'ah Islami, the Islamic group in Lebanon. And of course, sectarianism is hyper-present and visible, either domestically or regionally, or internally or externally, if you want, for that matter. And also in your paper, and as we will see in Brahim Gharaib's paper as well, it's something related to the internal structure of the Islamic group and their own internal debates and their attempt back in 2017 to secede from their mother group in Egypt and to adapt to the counter-revolution circumstances in other countries like Lebanon. So can you please shed some light on the most notable transformations that have taken place within the recent years when it comes to the Islamic Jama'ah Islamiyah, ever since the uprising in 2018 in Lebanon, and when it comes to the political and ideological discourses as well. Any transformations? Thank you very much indeed for hosting me. Thank you, colleagues and panelists. With regard to the transformations in the Islamic group, Jama'ah Islamiyah, particularly that were prompted by the Arab Spring revolutions, overlooking, of course, those before them in history, I believe that the most important transformation, as you have said, came in 2017, where they submitted a document titled Homeland's Vision, which summarized all Arab Spring-related experiences, including failures and successes. The Jama'ah Islami tried to say that it's a domestic local Islamic group rather than being affiliated with regional organizations from an organizational point of view. But in that vision, in between the lines and subversively, you can see that there is a network of ideas and thoughts that were really considered a burden, including the Palestinian cause, which was most important because they are inherently related to the Palestinian cause because of the fact that it's in the neighborhood and they're adjacent. And the second issue is the Lebanese issue, because Lebanon was established according to a formula that would ascribe Christians privileges and benefits at the expense of the majority of the other population, and which was a key factor to the civil war in Lebanon. And this issue still remains at the subconscious of the psychology of the group. And the second thing is the sectarianism or the school-based faiths or the faith-based schools, sorry. And also this has been reflected in what happened in Egypt with former President Morsi, is that the Iranian role was part, and the sectarianism was part of the counter-revolution. And therefore, this sectarian-based discourse has become dedicated and entrenched within their discourse. And also there were a number of early warning signs and ramifications that rendered this group as a role model for the other groups, Islamic groups, which is the sectarian based. So this factor, as it became entrenched, they realized that they have to try to do away with back in 2017, and hence the paradox. In 2011, because of the Iranian expansion and role, it has been dedicated and strengthened. After 2019, with the Lebanese revolution or the October uprising, they started to maintain balance and to distance themselves from the sectarian issue, prompted or aided by the role of Hamas movement, because Hamas has a special relationship with the group, and they remended the fences of their relationships with Iran. So recently, this has been reflected in an improvement and the rectification attempt. But it's not that easy for the Jama'ah, for the group, to overlook the catastrophes in Syria or what happened in Lebanon back in 2008 with Hezbollah sweeping through Beirut against the future Tayyar or current, the Sunni groups. And also, mind you, they do realize that Lebanon is a sectarian-based regime, and they are always in conflict, and that's why the Sunni sect now feels threatened. Its own existence, it feels it is threatened, and that's why Iran is trying to de-escalate the situation to maintain the balance. Or if the situation continues as is, we might be facing a renewed and revamped scene of sectarianism par excellence. Yes, just and mind you, there is interpretation, of course, and of course they will be posted with the interpretation subtitling on YouTube. So kindly be mindful to speak at a slower pace. Okay, my question about the Lebanese Syrian case and later the Jordanian case, I address to you, Mr. Shafiq. The multinational states, multi-sectarian states, multiracial states, what is the role of the Islamists in such nations or states? Are they part and parcel of the recruitments and polarization? Where is the concept of the consolidated, unified national identity? Is it at intellectual luxury because we're here dipping our feet in cold water, whereas the Islamists, they're held accountable to their grassroots and constituencies constituencies, and they cannot be that luxurious in thinking about it. So this consolidated, unifying a national identity and the concept of citizenship that should be the foundations of democracy are mere theoretical notions in a practical way. So, did the Islamic group realize such constraints and limitations and trying to revamp its role in a pragmatic way to be able to keep in tandem and abreast with these constraints, theoretically speaking?
الدور المطلوب منها.
Theoretically speaking, we can say yes. So the Jama'ah Islamiyya managed to understand its turn, but Islamists, their problem lies in 3 points. The first one is in the fact how they can promote their vision among their members, among their affiliates. The leaders might have a conference, they think in a certain way, and they move ahead. But when you go to the grassroots, even the second rank leadership and the third rank leadership, you see them standing still. So the advancement of the ideas looks very elitist. And this is because this group focus on dawah. They only practice politics with the outside, but not internally. The second point, they don't have the tools. If we come to the Jama'ah Islamiyya, the Islamic group, they live in a diverse group, in a Sunnah sect, and among the religious people. And among the religious people, it's only with the sect. And there are the Salafists, there are the independent people. So this is the second issue. They lack the tools. They lack the capacity with the human, even material capacity. And the third issue is the circumstances. The Orient is in turbulence, and the acceleration of turbulence puts this group in an area that does not have topography as if they are planning seamlessly. So whether you have bad intentions or good intentions and you want to implement them in the Orient, it is difficult to achieve anything. So these three factors might be the main causes that would disrupt the role of the Jama'ah. But the most important role, as the Jama'ah sees it, the Jama'ah in its vision think that every time, every phase, they present a paper and they present more advanced ideologies. But every time they present a more advanced paper in terms of their vision, it is accompanied or opposed by more backwardness in the street. So they recede in their popularity and they will be tied to the local and external political powers. So this opposite relationship, if we go more for more flexible and patriotic ideas, does not come from full convictions by the Jama'ah Islamiyya. I believe that these come from the circumstances, from the conditions, and they don't have the time to instill them and embed them. I'm not saying that they don't want to do this, but this has not been instilled inside the Jama'ah. It hasn't been institutionalized in the Jama'ah. And let me conclude with this point. The most important thing in the revolution that took place in Egypt is that it added legitimacy to transformations inside the Jama'ah. When the revolution in Egypt happened and when the Jama'ah embraced it, it found it easy. Since the mother movement did so, it managed to instill some traditions, and these are positive traditions that have to do with the national, local situation, so on and so forth. Thank you so much, Mr. Shafiq. We move to Mr. Ibrahim Gharaibi Abu Jihad, and his paper focuses on the Jordanian case, but he is aware of the Islamic cases in general, and he has a lot of ideas and comments regarding the repercussions of previous experiences in Syria and Lebanon. A Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan has been away from the sectarian issue and from crisis. This should have left the Muslim Brotherhood better off. But as you mentioned in your paper, the Muslim Brotherhood moved from an internal crisis to a crisis with the state to an ideological state, a new and an old Muslim Brotherhood group, the ones you called the new and old Muslim Brotherhood, and the triangle and the relationship between political Islam and its traditional Islamic group and the elitist group, the triad you talked about, and you asked for disengagement. Can you please explain what's happening in Jordan? Why do we have all these crises in Jordan? Why do we have all these crises in Jordan, although there should have been more space for more rational thinking and better development? Is it because of the Palestinian cause repercussions? And why the identity is an emergent, an urgent issue? If we take the Kurds, for example, it's different. But in Jordan, the issue of the identity weighs heavily down on everybody. Thank you, doctor. Thank you to all panelists. When Arab Spring started in Jordan, the Muslim Brotherhood had two, backdrops. Before Tunisia, we had wide-scale activism, demand-driven activism in the Jordanian street, and we even did this before Tunisia, like the teachers' union, agricultural union, workers, and the port workers union. So in this activism, it wanted to influence the locally driven reform rather than bigger titles and bigger slogans like the Muslim Brotherhood and other movements did, like Islamism, liberation, and the Palestinian cause. As for the Muslim Brotherhood, who lived this scene, watching it without getting engaged, they were in contact with this scene and they had internal debate. Although it was internal, but we could, some news leaks, and it's like demographic division on the identity of the group. We in Jordan, in our culture, we always give the movement names. The division in Muslim Brotherhood, we say it's the priority of liberation, the priority of the Palestinian cause. It's about Faisali and Wahdat, the two soccer teams. It's not about Jerusalem. Even in parliamentary elections, the candidate who wants to address the people, he says, we want to liberate Jerusalem. But it's what you and I know. It's about their grassroots, that I am your candidate. I'm the candidate of those constituencies. And this led to the increase in Hamas influence, and this affected the relationship of the Muslim Brotherhood and its relationship with Hamas and its contact with the Jordanian people and Hamas, the Jordanian citizens of Palestinian origin and Jordanian citizens of Jordanian origin. So we started feeling this since 2002. It was a landslide influence of Hamas that reflected in the internal elections of the Jama'ah that happened in 2002, and then in the parliamentary elections and the results of the parliamentary elections for the candidates in 2003, where the Islamic movement had 15, or 17 MPs who won seats in the parliament. Maybe Dr. Muhammad, you can correct me if I'm mistaken. Most of them were of Palestinian origin. Yes, correct. Dr. Muhammad said even the candidates of Jordanian origin, they won by Palestinian votes. I mean, by the influence of the Jama'ah on its Palestinian affiliates. Hamas had an impact on the Jordanian street and on the Jama'ah, and this was reflected in the election of the Secretary General of the Islamic Action Front, Zaki Bani Rashid. There was a public debate in the media that this is a person who was imposed by Hamas on the IAF, Islamic Action Front, and the Muslim Brotherhood. And there were delegates from the uh, IF and Muslim Brotherhood, the leaders of IF and Muslim Brotherhood went to Damascus to convince Khalid Mashal to convince or to influence Zaki bin Rashid to withdraw from elections. So this showed Hamas influence on the IF and the Muslim Brotherhood, and it went further. Some of the MPs for the some candidates for the parliament sent delegations to Khalid Mashal to influence their affiliates in Jordan to vote for a certain candidate in the parliament. And there has been some demands to change the seats of the Shura Council division, and it took the movement name. It was the bureaus and the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan. The bureaus are in the GCC. They call them the spaces of Hamas movement or bureaus of Hamas movement in the GCC. But the Irshad office, saved the situation by putting an end to the external influence, and that the elections orders and the work of the Jama'ah should be within its geographical space, and they shouldn't have any organizing outside the geography of their country, and to have a separation between the Palestinian and the Jordanian movement. There is the Palestinian and Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood. This, reduced the clashes. And then we started with the Arab Spring, and we started wide-scale activism that was strong and weak at times. We didn't know what we want, but it was clear that the Muslim Brotherhood felt, they bragged about the results of activism in Tunisia and in Egypt. This weighed down on their positions and how they dealt with the leadership in Jordan. And they felt they are peers, they felt power. To the extent that Zaki bin Rashid, the Secretary General of the IAF, he said that the political regime is saying nonsense about reform. So they felt, some threat to the community, to the state, to the public elections. And there was a sense of the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood put pressure to, calm things down, not to escalate. They influence their affiliates and their grassroots not to take out to the streets, but they used this de-escalation to put pressure on the regime and on the state. So there were people, young people in the Jama'ah who went out of control, and they got involved in the street activism without permission and without the endorsement of the political leadership. We remember when the Islamic Muslim Brotherhood youth went to the Dakhiliya circle, Hamza Mansour and the other people had a sit-in before Al-Kaluti Mosque to protest the Israeli embassy in Amman. And the Muslim Brotherhood created many occasions that never occurred to mind to celebrate many things. The celebration of the Saladin conquering of Jerusalem, and they started renting a lot of horses moving from Ajloun to Ajloun Castle. When the IF was trying to present some discussion with the government and with the some currents, the IF did not have a quorum because most of the Shura Council members went on horses to the castle in Ajdoun to remember Saladin, and the Omari pledge became something that they celebrated. So the Muslim Brotherhood never discussed these issues before the Arab Spring. They never celebrated these occasions before the Arab Spring. However, excuse me, I want to jump to another point. Let's get to the end of this context. The Muslim Brotherhood made some revisions. They presented reform initiatives. They adopted democracy, pluralism. They participated in democratic action in 2017-18 in Lebanon and Jordan. They disengaged too with the mother group in Egypt. They did many attempts. However, it's clear in your paper that the impact of the polarization is still present. And maybe later on we will open the floor for discussion because we need to hear from the scholars. You know, it's the iron fist that led to these clashes between the motherhood. In Jordan, you insinuate that the current Muslim Brotherhood is affected by Sayyid Qutb, and Shafiq mentioned the experienced Muslim Brotherhood members in Syria. Wa'ad Party, you know, was not popular. So despite of all this, this current is still the strongest current. Yes, the Islamic current has a lot of support, and in Iraq there is the Sunnah. In Jordan, there is the Palestinian component that supports the Muslim Brotherhood, and this gives a lot of momentum. And the religious case, its influence goes beyond the Muslim Brotherhood. It reaches the state level and the community level. As you remember, Dr. Muhammad, we together worked on the reform initiatives when the Islamic movements presented their vision in 2005, the Syrian, Egyptian, and Jordanian initiatives. And we worked on this in Al Ghad newspaper, and it was an American initiative. After 11th September, the conclusion the US arrived to is to open dialogue with the moderate Islamic movements to counter extremism. And they started a lot of dialogues. Certain dialogues we knew about, certain dialogues we don't know about in Morocco, in London, in DC, to put to influence the Muslim Brotherhood democratically. And an organization for democracy in the Middle East was established in the United States, and it was granted 30 million a year, and it was run by a group of American Muslim Brotherhood members of Arab origins to help the Islamic movements to have democratic transformation. And in the Arab Spring, there has been a lot of debates and opinions and in the notions. The main problem in the democratization of the Muslim Brotherhood is that it is a tactical, procedural transformation, while they have this separatist perspective. And we know that this created many problems. There is reform-minded leadership, and others are extreme-minded. And we know that the extremist discourse attracts more audience than the rational discourse. The rational discourse is fragile and it changes, it evolves, and these are the facts of the political action in all countries and all communities. The other issue for the Muslim Brotherhood is that they always try to provide democracy a religious favor, and this undermines the entire notion because the public domain is rational. There is no harm to be religious in the public domain, but this should be presented in the public domain based on rational. What are the interests and what are the harms? And this shouldn't be only based on what Albani said for the strategic partnership between the oil refinery and a foreign investor, for example. So the Muslim Brotherhood hasn't presented a rational explanation, an interest-based one. They got involved in interpreting religious texts. And this undermines democracy because democracy is a rational process based on the lack of knowledge and the probability of being wrong and that the other might be correct. So if you are involved in the public domain and you don't think that you might be wrong and the other might be correct, this means that you are running for office with things that you believe in. So why do you want to have elections? Why to go to the ballot box for things we believe in? We already believe in these things. I mean, the ballot box will not increase our belief and will not weaken our belief if people don't elect us. So what does election mean in this case? Democracy is undermined from within.
Well, you actually also imploded the session from within, just like what you have just said. So definitely you've imploded the session from within, as you have just suggested, and hit the core of the matter, as they say. And before opening the floor for back and forth discussions, and I do hope that we'll have some time, allow me before that address a question to Dr. Rhayel Ghoraibe. Dr. Rhayel, if we're here talking about the movements in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan as an identity-based revival, resurrectionist movements, as they are dubbed oftentimes, you at Zamzam Party, which and in previous conference, we dubbed your party as the post-Islam political Islamic period. So my question, frankly, your party was not well received and did not score well with its previously anticipated popularity. Is it because it distanced itself from the identity-based approach, whereas the people are pretty much immersed in identity-based discourse, or simply because your discourse is an elitist discourse, an elitist of the well-informed Islamists, if any? So would you have done better? Should you have been able to achieve this discourse? Or would it have been better for you to have stayed as a part of the brotherhood? You have 3 minutes to answer all these questions. All 3 questions in 3 minutes? Well, thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists and those in charge of the organization. And of course, we have to separate here things between intellectual, dialectical issues within the Islamic movement in general and Islamists as well, and the Arab Spring and the failures therein and the practices associated. Although they are interrelated factors, but the overall failure is not only for Islamists par excellence, no, but I believe it's for all political parties, regardless of whether they're faith-based or not, because it was a transformation from autocracy and despotism to democracy. And this is a transitional period, as I might dub it, and that's why all political powers, including the Islamic movements, were not able to discern and understand and comprehend the transitional period ideology, because now it's not about sharing of power and fighting for power, but rather they have to rally the support of all the society of all colors to finish this transitional period. Then we come to the competition and sharing of power agreements. And the Brotherhood, who won the majority, they should have been more aware of this particular meaning and interpretation, and therefore they share the larger responsibilities that in this period or transitional period or phase, that all should be engaging all parties, irrespective of the size of their presence or constituency, and at the grassroots level, and that we are just venturing from one phase to another smoothly without introducing any kind of sensitivities between the political Islam and the other competing movements. This is one point. The second point with regards to Jordan, of course, its country has its own specificity and issues with identities and sects. In Jordan, we will not undermine the issue, which is that there is a problem with identity and the Islamic movement. And you said that the Islamic cause has its impact on most Muslim countries, but in Jordan, it's the most of that visible impact, simply because part of an integral part of the Islamic movement actually is the fact that they constitute or established a Palestinian-based section or faction of this movement called Hamas. And in 2006 and 2007 only, then the independence took place for that faction, and it was formal rather than being actual. And the genuine true transformation is notable. And this is my interview with you when you were at Al Ghad newspaper. I said then it's high time for the Islamic movement in Jordan then, and for the Islamists in Jordan to adopt their own national reform scheme, because they were no longer partners in the decision, the Palestinian decision making. But they failed to do so, and that's why it's part of our issue and problem in Jordan. And of course, the identity-based issue remained as such. And another issue we have to admit is that if we say the Palestinian component of Jordan, not only the Islamists, because we have other parties and powers, because you can see the major parties that we were partnering with as Islamic, one of them is with the Palestinian Popular Front, Popular Liberation Front, and others from the Iraqi Ba'ath Party, others are affiliated to the Syrian Ba'ath Party, and all of those who are in charge are actually Palestinian origin. Jordanians have all been, in my point of view, represented
I'm proud to have Sarah because she worked hard seriously.
in the main body of the state, but rather they were not inclined to join parties. So we at Zamzam Party, we want to address the non-partisan segment of society, those who are not affiliated with parties. And when we have an organized political society association party that is capable of addressing issues in political, this silent group, we need to address them. But it seems even that is yet remains to be very early, because the overall political environment is not that conducive to allow such a power to rise. Of course, I do support distancing ourselves from political Islamic issue. Islam is a historical and cultural and civilized framework for the nation in its entirety, and no one has the right to hijack it or to be the custodian of Islam, again excluding others. And therefore, this should not prevent the Islamic parties to have their platforms and use whatever source they want, but not to offer themselves that they are the custodians and guardians of Islam and they're the spokesperson of Islam religion. No, since 99% of the population are Muslims, you provide your political platform that will be able to address the problems in society and the country. And the competition will be between those platforms rather than what is Islamic and non-Islamic. We're still to see the light at the end of this tunnel. And actually, their movement and discourse is always based on emotive mobilization of the groups, as Abu Jihad has just mentioned. The alternative struggle and the alternative jihad. This is always to capitalize on the emotive feelings of people, so that these movements will continue to secure the majority of support from the grassroots level. I used to be one of the leaders at the Politburo of the Brotherhood, and whenever we suggested an activity about the higher prices of oil or the bread and fuel subsidy, zero interaction, zero reaction from our constituents. But if it was an issue related to any Palestinian cause, and of course they're all enthusiastic and they will rally the support. So they say these are the constituents, these are the voters, and these are the voters that secure your seats in the parliament. This is the situation in brief. Thank you very much, Dr. Hayel. Please, mind you, you can also follow this session later on our social media websites, of course. And by you raise your hand if you want, and more reactions, raise your hand if you want to have an intervention. Before Mr. Mubarak, Dr. Heba has asked for the floor. Heba, then Mubarak, then we'll give around to the others. Thank you. May God reward you well for this invitation, for the colleagues who presented their papers. I'll start with the very last comment. Dr. Hayel, when he talked about the issues that the Palestinian cause is the key motive or engine of mobilization, and whenever they address public issues, they fail to gather the same momentum. Well, this is the result of the way the constituents were brought up and raised, because at the end you reap what you have sowed. At the outset, for tens and scores of years, we always connected the movement to the larger causes of Palestine and Jerusalem, albeit very important, but we failed to address the public issues locally, that people are in dire need of this ideological food, as they say, of thought, but they are incapable of addressing the daily issues, and because we failed to teach them to do so. That's why we need a strategic shift and a strategic transformation and the rethinking process. And of course, this would not be attainable with being out of the blue or just an elitist discourse. You need someone to redraft the discourse and rephrase it. We've always been saying with the advent of the 21st century that the brotherhood, they're having problems, and you are short on in-depth ideology. You cannot just simply fall back on outdated, obsolete discourse. You need to address the developments and the modernization developments and things that are reflected on the lives of Muslims on a daily basis in their own respective countries and as a result of the pool sourcing and also as a result of the globalization of the economy, etc. So the issue of prudence, politics in the jurisprudent sense of prudence, i.e. to be prudent in how you go about manage things. So yes, we are establishing within the Islamic movements or the Islamic revival or the resurrection or groups, organizations, you call them. Yes, we base our discourse on Islamic notions, but the language you're using, they will be accusing you of hypocrisy, that you have a double standard. No, I lay down the foundation of the Sharia based on what I say, based on my Islamic ideology. But of course, we need argumentation in the public space. But this is actually lacking in the pan-Arab culture after in the post-colonial Arab world. It's not like debates just like Sheikh Al-Ghazali and Farag Fouda. No, but debates to teach them on how to make an argument in public space, in public discourse, and how to engage others in a very rationalized and rational way, and also to how to be prudent about managing the best interests of people in general. This was poorly constructed, and also other challenges related to the intellectual sterility and the failure to develop a dialectic ideological discourse is the intergenerational plight or gap, as I call it. It's always a problem within the transformations of the social cohesion. Modernization will be massive. It shall leave nothing behind. Within years to come, the daily pattern of life shall be drastically different. And this is what we're seeing in various countries, of course, and even in the Egyptian case. The key transformation of the social cohesion, the social fabric itself is at stake, not only the movement. Thank you, Mr. Mubarak Al-Jiri from Kuwait, a researcher and a specialist in Islamic movement. Assalamu alaikum. We would have liked to see you, but it's possible. Unfortunately, I'm at a place that I cannot turn my camera on. However, most important thing is to convey the idea. First of all, I'd like to thank you all. It's quite a pleasure to be with you. This is my second time with you, Dr. Muhammad, and I'm honored to be here with this distinguished panel of researchers. Without further ado, I read Ibrahim Gharaib's paper, with regards on the impact of Arab Spring on Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan. And I found many things in common between the practice, behavior, and discourse of that brotherhood with the Islamic constitutional movement in Kuwait and the way they interact with the regime, the relationship with the regime. And I found, and this is a note, I don't know whether or not Dr. Garaibi agrees with me, is that the monarchies and the monarchies, the way they deal with the Islamic movements in Jordan, Morocco, Kuwait, and Bahrain, they have a similar discourse in dealing with the monarchies, and their relationship with the ruling royal family is the same. By being involved in the government or the size of their parliamentary presence or representation. And I read Brahim's paper, and he said that the political movements in Jordan, they tried to engage the political parties in Jordan, tried to engage the Muslim Brotherhood in a kind of a dialogue to secure a kind of participation in this. So my question, Dr. Brahim, don't you think that the hereditary or monarchies in Jordan, Morocco, and Kuwait, where they give a margin for the brotherhood to be involved, don't you think that the way they deal with the brotherhood is somehow similar? Thank you, Mr. Mubarak. Also, we want to see Engineer Ghaith Al-Qadha. And then Dr. Hisham. Engineer Ghaith Al-Qadha. And he was in charge of the youth movement in the Islamic Action Front, and now he is with the Youth and Salvation Party, which are constituted of a previous brotherhood membership. And he is the author of the book, I Used to Be a Brotherhood Member. How can I raise a hand? Okay. Thank you indeed. Actually, two questions. One addressed to Abdurrahman Al-Haj about Syrian experience. You mentioned in your intervention that you failed to find any drastic transformation in their discourse. So my question to you, what is the type of discourse you're after? What is the type of change you would find in their discourse so that you can say that there is a drastic change? And do you think that this circumstances theory would allow the brotherhood to offer a new discourse given the war, the embargo, the blockade, and all what we know about Syria? The second question is addressed to Dr. Brahim Garaibi. Your description is quite close to reality. However, a question addressed to you as a researcher in social transformation field. Why do you expect for the brotherhood to achieve the full transition from within 5 to 10 years from one extreme ideology to the other extreme? Why do we want from the pro-Sayyid Qutb proponents to adopt an ideology like Al-Ghannouchi, the leader of the brotherhood in Tunisia, or more pragmatic generation of leaders? Don't you think that this needs a long time of practice? Why do we want them to take off their cloak or to take off their hat of their old ideology and put another cloak or another hat of different ideology, and then we say, okay, they have changed? Because when we studied the famous Imam al-Ashra, when he left the Mu'tazila school of thought, took him like 13 years, and he burned all of his books that he has authored as a result of transformation, but took him 13 years. So this change within the brotherhood would need a very long time, a very longer period of political practice, and their training day by day. Every day they face a crisis, and then they learn how to deal with it and how to become members of the royal dialogue committees. So day by day they're learning, but it's going to take a long time before the brotherhood can achieve the shift from one thing to another that is totally different. And one last brief comment, if you may allow me, with regards to Dr. Hayal's Garaibi comment, and he is my professor and mentor, my first mentor for that matter, at the Brotherhood I believe that the interaction with the local issues with the brotherhood, it's not only regional in the in negative adverse sense of the word, regionally. I believe there was a historical context, of course, made mandatory by the Palestinian cause and the Pan-Arab. Also for the brotherhood in the Jordan, it's always item number two in their platform is the Palestinian cause. So whether like it or not, Dr. Ibrahim Gharaib, Dr. Hayr Gharaib, we were all pretty much preoccupied with the Palestinian cause, of course, wholeheartedly, day and night, rain or shine. 1967 Six-Day War, the occupation of the West Bank. So the Brotherhood's interest was not because they had a regional perspective, but it's actually a part of the overall historical context. It's well placed within the context. Now, with the Arab Spring, it has rectified the course and made people like me and Dr. Hayr Ghalaibe think differently that is closer to the national, local interest of the citizens, of course.
Two quick remarks. So Brahim Gharaide says, you want to wait for them? I've waited for them for 30 years. My hair gone gray and you lost your hair. And Abu Said, lost his hair. We're getting old. To clarify, they didn't deny the Palestinian cause, but rather they said they overlooked the internal policies, and this is what the female doctor commented in. Hisham Jafar and then Khalil Anani. You're on mute, Dr. Hisham.
شكرا يا دكتور محمد وانا سعيد
Thank you, Dr. Mohammed, and I'm happy to be among this elite group of people, and I thank the presenters of the three papers because they drew my attention to something. I wrote the long comment that I sent yesterday on the papers. In the first session, I thought we should reconsider the Islamic exclusion from political practice, and Dr. Ruman mentioned this strongly. And in this session, if we come from the opposition gateway, the issues that should be raised might not be appropriate. And maybe the three papers drew my attention to something very important. This is the gateway that is very important, or the entry point that is very important, which you talked about in details. It's how we, or how the Muslim movements can have national patriotic policies. And this is something imposed by the Arab Spring. And the three papers mention this. They say, we are not in opposition. We're not in a normal regime that where you can be in the position. We're not talking about sharing power with the Syrian government or regime, and you will not be able to go beyond the sectarianism, not even in Jordan or Lebanon. So the best entry point would be to talk how can local policies expand or shrink inside the Islamic movements. This is the entry point we need to address, because the Arab Spring presented this problem strongly. And another important thing you mentioned, it paraphrased the relations between the different components, i.e., we talk about territoriality and country-based relationships, and they have a narrative. Ibrahim mentioned this, with all due respect to your titles. Ibrahim mentioned this in the beginning of his paper on what is needed of the Islamic movements. They need to address the Arab Spring narrative, or with the main hypothesis to create a national consensus and to have development and democracy related policies. So this is the core of their papers, to put it very briefly. In the long comment, I try to conclude what we can call 7 main rules or 7 main themes that we can think about or we can have a debate on. I will mention them quickly because the paper, you have my paper and you can disseminate it. Yes, we can disseminate your paper. In my opinion, this has nothing to do with the Muslim Brotherhood only, but also to the Salafi jihadism, which is mentioned strongly in Syria. We're talking about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So the issue of the organizational boycott, whether with the mother group, the Muslim Brotherhood, or the other Salafi jihadism like Qaeda or ISIS or ISIL. So this is one hint we started to see strongly in the last years. We also talk about the nature of the organization itself. The nature of the organization is something of paramount importance. Are we in the process of establishing an organization with a closed membership with certain restrictions, or are we targeting a grassroots movement? And here I'm talking about da'wah and charity themes because these are ruled by other notions. But when we're talking about politics, the nature of the organization is of paramount importance, and the issue of the leadership, the nature of the leadership elite. And here we have, or we raise a number of issues mentioned by Mr. Ibrahim. Dr. Shafiq Shuqair also mentioned these about the transformation in the leadership structure in Lebanon. He mentioned that they played the regional roles because they had ideological, jurisprudent, and dawah tendency. But then there was some activism in the leadership makeup. And Mr. Ibrahim also talked about the leadership structure in the Jordanian organization and its influence and the difference between the different components. So this is another part. Another important issue we need to pick up, mentioned by Dr. Hiba, it's the issue of the youth structures. The main comment here is that the youth in the Arab Spring went beyond their organizations and the status of women. The status of women in the organization is of paramount importance. It's not something to celebrate because the Arab Spring narrative brought back involving women in the public debate. And this is something we can discuss in details when we come to the theme on the Islamic movements and the status of women. So this brings us to the nature of the organization and the leadership structure. Also mitigating the ideology inside the organization. And realistically speaking, this is happening. We're talking about what the Jama'ah Islamiyya in Lebanon said and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria, what they presented and what has been raised in Jordan regarding the Sayyid Qutb ideology in the organizing. So they're trying to mitigate the ideological trend, and this can be called mainstreaming politics. Now, facing sectarianism and school of thought, like Dr. Hayels mentioned, it's not only related to Haraka Islamiyya or Islamic movement, but rather to all political powers. Are they capable of presenting a national platform that goes beyond the sect and tasting sectarianism? Can we do this from a sectarian background or from a nationalistic background? So we have a big deficit that has nothing to do with the Islamic movements, but the states themselves, the regimes themselves, the regimes that have been formed even post-Arab Spring, post-Arab crises, they cannot present a national platform. They polarize, they try to achieve their legitimacy through these pathways. So these are the elements that we need to pick up when we discuss this thing. Finally, because I took so much of your time, there is something related to geostrategic gain at the different levels, the geostrategic game. How can we interact? How can we have such an interaction when it comes to the geostrategic game at the regional and international level? This interaction will help present local policies, and how do you position yourself in this framework? And this happens at different levels. When Hayat Tahrir Sham, position itself in the Turkish Western team against the Russian Iranian axis, this makes a difference. Finally, and we're speaking among an elite group of people, the binaries, the Palestinian cause and its status, what's regional and what's local. All these binaries can be present at the level of the practice or thoughts. But can we go beyond these binaries to do paraphrasing around the idea, like Hiba mentioned, around the discourse that is presented? The discourse presented will create these binary systems, or maybe try to mitigate these problems to a large extent. Sorry for taking so much of your time. No. Thank you, Hisham. Dr. Khalil, Dr. Hisham had a very important point. The entry point is not that the Islamists in the opposition square, we're not talking about traditional government or traditional opposition. We're talking about regimes in extraordinary circumstances. So he talked about Islamists and the political and the local policies. Here, we're not only talking about opposition, we're talking about Islamists in opposition and the local crises and struggles. We were talking a couple of days ago about how we can raise questions. How can we raise the questions that were raised 10 years ago? Are they the same ones that we need to raise today, or are there different questions? It's clear from the Syrian, Jordanian cases that the pan-Arabism is raised differently. And you have a new book. Congratulations for the new book you edited on Islamists and the Arab Spring. So through this, before, we take your comment. What do you think of this discussion? Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, DC time. I would like to thank all speakers. Thank you, Dr. Muhammad, for the great opportunity. And I would like to thank you for all the comments. I will build on your question. Your question, Dr. Muhammad, is really important. It takes us a bit away. We were zooming out and try to think of our way as researchers and scholars in dealing with this. And this is a very important point in understanding the transformations of a certain phenomenon, especially the Islamic phenomenon. And I was focusing on how we deal with the Islamic revolution. I call it a drastic change in approaching this complex phenomenon. I read the 3 papers. I'm sorry I joined you a bit late because I had another meeting, so I couldn't hear the presentation of the 3 speakers who spoke in the beginning of the session. Your question is very relevant, Dr. Muhammad, is very valid, because the Arab Spring is an extraordinary circumstance because it influences the actors' movements and how they position themselves in this extraordinary framework. And this imposes on them raising questions that were not raised before. It's difficult to talk about, issues that are of holistic nature. In the Arab Spring, we talk about the details. Citizens went out to ask for freedom, justice, and dignity, and this took us away from the identity of the state and what Hiba called the housekeeping issues for citizens. Some people went beyond this and they got integrated, and some other people remained in their old discourse. So now, studying the transformations of the Islamic movements is really very complex, and it involves factors with different weights that vary according to the cases. But what's difficult is that these are in motion, they're not static. Like the Arab Spring, there is some sort of static movement here, so you can witness if there was a transformation or not. When the Muslim Brotherhood in 2004 talked about reform, the reform initiatives that had some sort of a holistic vision, it's different from in a revolutionary reform. You talk about reform. You want to go beyond the reform-minded ideology. You're talking about revolution. You can't talk about reform anymore. It's very limited reform in the existing structure. You want to change the existing structure. So studying the phenomenon when it's in motion is more difficult than when it's static. So we need to consider the context. And here, this is what I missed in the three papers last time and this time, i.e., there is, the Muslim, the Islamic movement is a, is a key actor. They are independent. They are not a follower. So they're moving based on their initiative. And this is incorrect. It was a reaction to certain transformations that they were taken by surprise with. So the context plays a major role here. And this takes me to the situation in Jordan in particular. It's no secret, Dr. Ibrahim Gharaib, we always enjoy your great writings, but I'm surprised how he described the Jordanian case. And, Dr. Muhammad, you mentioned this as well. The general image is that the Muslim Brotherhood in its previous version is that it's extremist and that Qutb-mindedness domain. And from my impression, and I'm not as expert and as active as Rahayel and Quda are, but I'm an observer. I know about the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan that they are more active than the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt throughout the last 20 years. There are divisions, there are, separatists. Rahay al-Gharabi left them, Dr. Bassam left them, Ibn Bad left them and created his own association. So the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan is dynamic, is more diverse. Hawks and dogs, the youth are trying to leave. So this shows a dynamic group, an ever-changing group. There are divisions. It's not static. It's not a static group. It's not a dormant group. So when I read an extremist religious group and I need an explanation of the extremist religious group, this puts you in isolation. The issue of isolation, we need to consider the context, and the Jordanian government takes responsibility. Here, are we talking about independent or a follower? When we consider the Islamic movements, we shouldn't forget the Mukhabarat state or the secret intelligence state and how they benefit from these internal problems. Why Ibn Baz wanted to create an association? Because the Muslim Brotherhood had legal issues. But this has been going for 70 or 80 years. This has to do with the political circumstances. Who is benefiting from these internal issues in the Muslim Brotherhood? Even if Nebat managed to create his own association, the formality is different from reality. The Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, they're an old group. Even, that's why the regime is trying to create another association. So it has to do with the codification or legalization of what has been there for decades. And this raises an important question. If the regime in Jordan or in any other authoritarian state has an issue with the most representative factor, why don't they allow other movements to join the regime against this movement? And I agree with Mr. Quda and his great presentation on what has been left of the Muslim Brotherhood if they respond to all these pressures, or what would be left of Islamists if they become something else other than Islamists. And this doesn't mean that they shouldn't be static. This brings me to the positionality of us as scholars, because I noticed that there is confusion between the personal position and the objective position. We are trying to interpret the phenomenon differently. I want to learn what is the behavior rather than interpret the behavior of the phenomenon. In these papers, I wanted to see some, interviews with the actors themselves. I want to see one perspective that overlaps with the position of the state vis-a-vis these movements. So the position, how we position ourselves in this phenomenon, this is something we need to interact with. How do I position myself vis-a-vis this phenomenon? Because we are being judgmental, not analytical. I'm not interested in saying that the Muslim Brotherhood are good or bad. I want to understand why by hearing what they say about themselves, how I see them. It's not that we don't have positions. We respect everybody's position. But when we talk about such interpretations, I need to take a step back from my bias to see whether they are good or bad. And this is not the story.
So I want to say it's quite a complicated issue. And actually, when we approach this phenomenon, would prompt us as researchers to reconsider our research tools and our interpretive methodology. Quickly, if you allow me, quite a generic remark about Dr. Al-Hajj's paper, a true friend indeed. But I believe that there's too much detail therein. I would have preferred to see a well-focused paper on one or two movements, and then I see their prior record and I track their history of development, because he talked about movements, networks, and groups, Salafis, Jihadis, Sufis, domestic and foreign. I'm lost. I'm missing in action, quote unquote, in this case. So I would have liked to have seen one or two movements taken as an example to be analyzed in depth and then to come up with recommendations. And also, I'm confused because the Kaftaria, Kobesiyat, and the like movements are actually affiliated with the regime. These are not political Islam movements par excellence, or at least in the way we mean it or understand it. So that's why we need to focus on certain pinpointed movements or groups, and then to put them in the Syrian context and to track their transformation. And there was a dialectical issue I failed to grasp, is that the Islamists had no role whatsoever in the Syrian revolution in particular, whereas I do know that they were very, very influential in the National Council and the Syrian Revolution. There were inter alia other factions, of course. But I failed to see that, and I got confused. Did they have a role, or did they not have a role in the Syrian Revolution, so that we can measure and gauge the transformation? Yes, it's a good paper with many details, but too much. Too much disconnection. We need further coherence of the content. Thank you indeed, Dr. Khalil. And I do commend Dr. Khalil and Dr. Hisham for the newly issued books on the topics. Mind you, thank you, Dr. Muhammad. Thank you, Mubarak Al-Jari, because also you are co-authors in that book of mine. Okay, send us a copy. So, Mr. Hassan Abu Haniya, Dr. Khalil Anani has just referred to an idea suggested by Nathan Brown. And I think that it needs further consideration. We as researchers, we more often than not, we deal with the Islamic ideology as an independent variable, but rather it should be a dependent variable, because it's not that independent. It's auxiliary sometimes. And also you have authored a book on Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, including Dr. Hayel's point of view and Wright's point of view. In light of all of the above, how do you see things, Hassan? Hassan, where are you? Did we lose you?
طيب
احنا عايزين نشوف غيث وليس فقط حسن.
We want to see Ghaith as well. Ghaith, not only Hassan.
لانه غيث اجى عندي وانا ماخذ
Yes.
المطعوم
Because Ghaith came and I received the jab, the vaccination, and I'm still confused. But make sure that your intervention is not that confused. Well,
احب عشان المترجمين تفضل.
and take it easy on the interpreters, he's telling them. Well, as you were saying, at the end of the day, these are Islamic movements, yes, but they are, at the end of the day, social movements. Yes, of course, their traditional discourse was hegemonic and how to deal with the religion and faith-based issues. But of course, they were all social groups. And of course, their incarnated interpretations have always approached upon ideology. And of course, they always adopted the traditional ideological discourse, both of the Quran and the Sunnah, that is the Prophet's tradition. And of course, they can never sever themselves from those founding rules. And that's why their interpretations will be part and parcel of Islam itself par excellence, and it won't be different. And therefore, this is the difference between Asaf Bayan and Olivier Roa, who deals with the Islamic movement as a failure. And of course, we seen that he was wrong simply after 2011. And Asaf Bayati's expectations were better because he did not see them as a failure, but rather as a development, a step higher in the Orientalist sense of the word. And they always say that if any Muslim Brotherhood member or any Islamist would apply his own personal interpretation and exegesis, he would be parting company with the norms. It's like the traditional Salafist perspective. But of course, no, this is part and parcel of Islam as per the different schools and sects. And therefore, dealing with Islamic movements, some suggested that, well, they parted company with their movements or they became renegades. Well, this is a remnant of the Orientalist discourse, that if you're not this, then you're outside Islam. It's not the case. So there is a different perspective. We're not talking about the sense of the democracy in the third wave, which is a deal and a barter trade. There is no trade here. We have regimes in the Arab and Islamic and Muslim countries are dictatorships or despotic. As the Chatham House studies have indicated, they're despotic regimes, of course, authoritarian. And to talk about the failure of these movements should prompt one to laugh. Quite cynical. Now, a movement has won a landslide victory. If they come back to power, would they? If they run again for the election, would they win or not? So, what is the standard to judge whether this is a success or a failure? If these movements make their own business of just praising the regime that is despotic, would they then become successful or otherwise? So that's why the geopolitical context is of paramount importance. The Muslim Brotherhood,
لانه في داخل مجلس
they were not subjected to the uprooting phenomenon theory. Even within the National Security Council in the States, they still have not all agreed on the uprooting. Some are calling for the uprooting of those movements, and others are calling for the inclusion and integration. And the best result is the AKP party in Turkey. And therefore, after Trump has lost and with Biden's administration, the issue of inclusion and integration of the moderate movements will be revived. We'll see them in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. They will go back to the discourse of inclusion and integration, not because those authoritarian regimes want this to happen, but simply because those regimes have no longer a margin or a room to play, because they've always been weighing on several other powers in their behavior, but now they were not able to contain them. Not even other groups were not able to be that controlling or hegemonic, be they the Salafis or the leftists. The only exception is the Muslim Brotherhood, who managed to establish their presence ever since inception as a movement, as Kari Witham said, and as we all say. Yes, there are conservatives who are religious clerics, and there are pragmatists, and there are reformists. All of these are within the one group, the Muslim Brotherhood, ever since its inception. This is nothing new. More often than not, these rival factions, reformist or national or domestic, etc., should not always indicate that this is a positive development. Also, we as researchers, we should not become also ideologized or become ideological and see ourselves as part of the whole process. But this is something happening for all Arabs and Muslims. Just like Salman Said's perspective, which is the restoration of Khilafah as an analytical notion. Analytical means it's political, social, rather than ideological notion and concept. And therefore, I do believe, and as we've seen oftentimes, that this movement has one option. Either they should adapt themselves to coexist with a despotic authoritarian regime, or it's a failure. Well, it happened in Egypt and in Algeria, but was this something good? You know what happened. And some criticize Sayyid Qutb. What's wrong with Sayyid Qutb? Any movement worldwide, of course, they have rival factions and different currents within a democratic setting of providing the overall public space, as Haberman has indicated. Unfortunately, most regrettably, we see that our whole game is played according to rules controlled by foreign powers. So we always ask the Americans, what would you do if Trump would classify the Brotherhood as a terrorist organization? Of course, he would not do that. But even our options are neither rational nor domestic or homegrown. They're always outsourced and foreign. And we have, as researchers, we have to be more open and more able to grasp and understand these movements. Yes, these movements, they do develop even ideologically, but let's sever ourselves from the Orientalist perspective. If they develop, it doesn't mean that they are giving up on their own foundation or their own ideology, but rather within our own perspectives about Islam. Thank you. It's clear that Ghaith, your son, is actually making some commotion. He's having a nice time, your son there. So, Mr. Mbarak, good to see you. Dr. Amal Grami, do you have anything to comment on?
دكتور أمل. دكتور عبد الحكيم. أستاذ أحمد زغلول. طيب معناته نعود إلى
Okay, so we'll go back, but we start from backward now with Ibrahim Gharaibeh. Of course, you are a professor. You are the master magician who taught us this art. The question, what are the new questions to be addressed? And actually, you do address them at the end of your paper. What are the questions researchers in the field of Islamic movements should raise to reach outcomes and answers that would benefit everyone at the end of the day? Well, thank you very much indeed. I will try to answer while incorporating the comments presented by the colleagues, starting with Mubarak's point, because it actually sums up and encapsulates all the ideas about the relationship between the monarchies and the Muslim Brotherhood. Yes, the Muslim Brotherhood are the product of the conservative monarchies, because post-World War I, we had national states, independent national states, for the very first time in even the entire history, not also in the region, because we had only at World War I 25 independent countries. Now we have 200 independent countries who are members of the United Nations. When those monarchies and states were formed as nation states and wanted to endow it with a religious umbrella, just like King Fuad I in Egypt and King Abdullah I, the founding king in Jordan, and King Mohammed V, who is the founder in Morocco, King Abdulaziz Al Saud in Saudi Arabia. They always introduced a national scheme or project, but that is in tandem with Islam. And actually, the religious establishment and the traditional religious figures then were not that appropriate to this project. So the conservative monarchies then, they needed a more educated, more enlightened partner, and who is also related to religion moderately, but also has enthusiastic for the new state. And therefore, this has prompted the production of these figures and groups who became partners of those conservative monarchies to suggest a modern, contemporaneous form of the state in an Islamic context. And that's why those religious figures, they won scholarships to study in the West, and while at the same time trying to introduce their own Islamic vision of the story. And for the very first time in history, we have Islamic economy, Islamic media, Islamic state, Islamic attire, etc. You name it, everything is Islamic. We try to revamp modern contemporary life in an Islamic cloak. And now it's even more religious than what God has ordained. It's more royal than the king, as they say. In Jordan, back in the 90s, we had like 900 mosques, but now we have 10,000 mosques in Jordan. So actually, what things is happening with the political regimes or the Islamic movements is the reverse migration, i.e. to introduce a rational redrafting and rephrasing of the Islamic ideology. Of course, people can believe in whatever they want. No one can force them to believe or disbelieve, but actually they have to do it in a contemporary way. All movements, including the Brotherhood, they have to introduce a rational revision and to become part of the public space based on rational, mundane issues rather than ideological issues. Even all those researchers, many master's theses and PhD dissertations have been written about the Islamists being proponents of modernization, and also how to deal with the jizya or / tribute that should be paid to the Muslims, and also if Albani, who is a very famous scholar about the prophetic traditions in the hadith of what is correct or incorrect, and always they misquote, specifically when they fall back on famous landmark historical events like Al-Hudaybiyah Reconciliation Pact and Agreement, and they use it as an analogy. And everything that you deal with, you have to seek the analogy of Prophet Yusuf or Joseph with the infidel king back then in history. We want everything to be based on rational approach that believes in the principle that I might be wrong, you might be correct, and vice versa. We, in our even religious meetings, we establish our ideological position that is supported by religion, but we should not present it to the public on an ideological faith-based assumption. It's a reverse migration for the course of it's a reversing the course of the past 100 years of producing those movements. Now we need to go the other way around to think about a new way of introducing a contemporary ideology. We're not required to relinquish ideology, and it would be good if we relinquish ideology in favor of better ideologies, but of course it has to be rationally based when we become engaged in public space. Mr. Shafiq.
شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you indeed. I'll be focusing on 3 points. One, an issue of terminology. The post-Islamists or Islamism, quote unquote, I believe everything that is post something conceals more than it reveals, hinders more than it facilitates. So first of all, we need to do away with something called post something. And I do agree with what Hassan has said and expressed well and aptly put it. Yes, this issue in particular, I addressed it in my paper titled Soft Ideology and the Future of Islamists After the Arab Spring. There is always a hastiness in post-Islamist. Who decides the demarcation line when something becomes post-something? Of course, with all the other cases, all other ideologies, all other movements, there is something that could happen and develop. The second thing is the Qutb proponents, Sayyid Qutb proponents in the Brotherhood. It has now become an obsolete terminology, and actually it could mislead more than it guides researchers. Because some meanings are there, genuine, sometimes rigidity. To express the rigidity of organization, they say this is a Qutb-like or based approach or proponents. Extremism is called Qutb. So now Qutb has become a very broad term that would not help the researcher to discern and differentiate between things, particularly given the current developments. So the Qutbism, i.e. Qutb proponents should, or based mentality should be overcome. And there is something missing. And I'm here using Brahim's way of describing it in a cynical way, babbling. There is lots of babbling in jurisprudence, but there is no jurisprudent weight. I have never seen a researcher who ascribed the necessary correct weight for Islamic jurisprudence when discussing the Islamic movement situation. We either talk about Khilaf and how to manage the state. I mean, as critics, I'm not talking about Islamists. Islamists, by de facto, they use the religion. It's their founding text and regulation. But of course, many of those issues were because they had conflict over the exegesis and the interpretation of the text or the script, like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda. It's always was a disagreement on the interpretation of the script, the religious script. But what is a difference in management and prudent management of the state would not be that influential, but rather the ramifications. Of course, the Islamic situation would turn a new leaf or a new page, sorry, and then they try to adapt it and cloak it with an Islamic-based script. And therefore, the jurisprudent difference here is more than about management, but rather how to describe it from a religious basis.
The other issue, and I learned a lot from the paper of Dr. Hisham. It was really useful, fruitful, and inspiring as far as it is concerned, because he talked about the entry point and the local policy. This is the true entry point, because the criteria, what is the criteria for the failure that Brother Hassan talked about? This meets this idea. So rather than looking for failure and success, let's start with the criteria and the local oriented policy. Are Islamists going back to the local issues and the local policy and the geostrategy? Monarchy mentioned by Mubarak. Monarchy, yes, we need to consider what is the environment for every Islamic group. In Jordan, I was trying to develop a paper for Jordan, and I met all people from Jordan in this call. What is worth mentioning is that the neighboring countries of Jordan are very complex, very complicated. Nevertheless, the Muslim Brotherhood did not get involved in any problem. They are surrounded by sectarianism, but they are not involved in sectarianism. and they don't have different school of thoughts in the Islamic group in Jordan. Even the Islamic cause, it's been the paramount issue. So because it's a monarchy, because it's a stable country, this is very positive. This stability and this coverage around the Muslim Brotherhood made it less territorial, less regional in practice, and more regional in its discourse. So I also believe that the geostrategic environment and developing assumptions about the transformation of the environment in Jordan post Arab Spring, there has been some transformation. If the transformation went beyond that, would we see things like in Syria? Would what happened in Syria repeat itself in Jordan? And the final point is that we need a scale in all the studies and in all critique of Islamists. There is the critique. Sometimes we have an ideological, there is an ideology in critique rather than uh, the critique that was mentioned by Dr. Anani. So we have an ideology of critique rather than study the phenomenon. We need to, cut down on the ideology. And like the other gentleman who said, I was Ikhwaniyan, I was a Muslim Brotherhood member. If I was a Sunni, what I would do. If I was a Shia, what I would do. I don't think that this will help. And I'm not talking about Ghaith, of course. But he drew my attention to the fact that when we critique the a Muslim Brotherhood case in research, or if you have an experience with the Muslim Brotherhood and you want to get out of this religious experience, sometimes you become a secular person and you critique your Islamic experience. And this brings us to some taboos that we never tread on. But in drafting, we need more accuracy. I want to tell you that Ghaith left Muslim Brotherhood and got involved in a more difficult political party. So he can understand me very well. I don't mean Mr. Ibrahim because his paper did not have any personalization. I'm talking about how we can benefit for the future. And we learned a lot from everybody, even the paper on Syria. It requires a lot of time to think about it because the Syria case is really complicated. And I told Hisham, Hayat Tahrir, Asham is a unique case. It requires a special category like Ahrar al-Sham. Hassan Abu Haniya and myself, finished a book about the fall and rise, the rise and fall of ISIS, and we talk about the religion guards, including Hayat Tahrir Sham and the transformation of Jabhat al-Nusra or al-Nusra Front. Dr. Abdurrahman, thank you, my colleagues who took the burden and read the paper. As Dr. Khalil mentioned, it's full of details, so may God help them, with this paper that they have read on Syria. I would like to thank Dr. Hisham for his remarks and comments and his critique, Khalil and Ghaith as well. I want to start with Ghaith and then move to Khalil. He asked about the transformations, about the movement, the Muslim Brotherhood movement. First, I want to say, so far, we haven't built benchmarks for the transformation of the movements to identify the future transformations, to understand what kind of transformations these are. It's all personal. We haven't developed benchmarks for these movements. Second point, we haven't, or we still have an issue in approaching this Islamic movement. Do we approach it from the angle of social movements, or from the political parties angle, or from governance and local governance? From which angle shall we approach the Islamic movement, or from which perspective? Although it's all valid, but we need more study. And the other methodological issue Dr. Khalil mentioned that we can address in a more prolonged way. When we talk about interviews, this comes under the new history approach. Are we going to discuss these movements from the new history or the comparative history or the social ideology and mix it with the political sciences perspective, the political regime perspective? Are we capable of studying the Islamic movements from a quantitative perspectives? So the methodology requires an independent research. We don't have in the Arab world. Yes, true. Every researcher, relies on their own experience and background, but the methodology has not been raised adequately in the Arab world. So I agree. We have an issue with the methodology that we need to reconsider. Now, let me move to what are the things that should, we ask about the transformations that the Islamic movement witnessed. In Syria, we can't talk about the Islamic movement. We can't talk about the Muslim Brotherhood because it's a different story in Syria. But let's talk about the Muslim Brotherhood. First, when we talk about transformation, I'm not talking about desired change. It's, the things that we need to consider, like the membership of the Muslim Brotherhood, their ideology, their relationship to other parties, the youth, how capable they are to create new young leaders and their political platforms. These haven't witnessed any transformation. Let me tell you something funny about the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. The Muslim Brotherhood in Syria got involved in a compounded a crisis in the Islamic crisis. There is a generation gap between the youth and the seniors, and the regional climate against the Muslim Brotherhood that came with the opposite revolution made the Muslim Brotherhood to be self-entrenched. There was a new leadership, a young leadership. They tried to involve them in the Shura Council and the political bureau. But with this pressure, a couple of years ago, they eliminated them. All the old guard came back and they took back their positions because they can access the voters based on religion, allegiance. So they eliminated the youth movement inside the Muslim Brotherhood who tried to imitate the Islamic or the Tunisian model. The second issue is that the Muslim Brotherhood, when they were in the opposition, they had an ideology. Okay, great. And then in the revolution, they couldn't be part of local governance. They couldn't control territories. Ideology in war doesn't work. Everyone has an ideology that they fight on. So it's a local issue. Ideology was useless, was futile. They couldn't apply it on the ground. So they went back to zero weight. They have nothing to offer but to be part of the political coalitions which face the same problem. The third thing which is relevant, this is the only transformation we can talk about, but compared to another phase, we need to reconsider it. When the Muslim Brotherhood found themselves in war, in revolution, and they were not able to stay in the opposition, and they were not able to compete with the Salafi jihadism, they took a new model. Can we call it a liberation movement? I'm not sure, but it's a political body with an army. The army is in alliance with the state. So it's not only a militia, organized militia, armed militia that is in alliance with the country. So this is the big transformation that happened. But what are the repercussions of such an alliance? It's difficult to tell because it has to do with the fate of the North. Going back to what Dr. Khalil mentioned, I'm sorry for taking much of your time. You have only 1 minute. Dr. Khalil, I want to enjoy my minute. Dr. Khalil, maybe you accidentally read that the Muslim Brotherhood did not take part in the revolution. It's not the Islamic movement, and they haven't been involved in the revolution. They were incapable of mobilization. They are not even in Syria. Even the organizations in Syria, they can all be in one track and get rid of them. They don't have any impact on the community. It's the domino effect, just like any other Arab revolution. They were part of the domino effect, and this pushed the revolution to the largest extent. So they couldn't opt out. The Muslim Brotherhood did not participate. They only adapted to the new norm. So the question which you mentioned, what are the new questions that should be raised? What are the new transformations that we need to ask about? What are the new reactions that we need to discuss? This is our new question, and it applies to the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, just like other Muslim brotherhoods. And in the paper, there was no detailed discussion of the vision of this big movement and its interaction with other Islamic movements inside Syria. To give you the conclusion here, yes, indeed, I tried to explore the dynamics of these movements to take this approach, and it's good to try to interpret this movement and try to predict it in the future, but it's really difficult. Although I managed to identify some dynamics, but it's difficult to get to one benchmark. This requires a bigger effort. Maybe we are still in the process of thinking. We need to think more about this. Thank you, Dr. Abdurrahman. Before I conclude the session, thank you for staying with us for such time for this really heavy session. We are still we want to talk about Salafists post Arab Spring as another session on women and Islamists and the transformation in the discourse of Islamists and the role of women in the discourse and the external policies of the Islamic movements and how the geopolitical situation influences the Islamic movements. Thank you so much, everybody. And there are many points, many discussions, and many questions that are left hanging without an answer. And maybe in future sessions, we continue the discussion. And here, I would like to say that there will be a final session to ask about the Islamic movements and to raise the new and the old questions, the methodology. So as a group of scholars, we should focus on these issues. Dr. Khalil, did you want to say anything? No, I just wanted to reiterate what Dr. Abdurrahman said in the beginning of his intervention about the methodology in the Islamic movements. You said there will be a final session on this, and I hope there will be a particular session in the future that bring together all those great scholars, male and female scholars. We as Arab scholars, we need to reconsider our methodology, how we can combine our efforts in dealing with these sophisticated issues. So maybe in the center you pay more attention to these issues. Yes, in the final session we will see who would like to speak about these issues from the scholars and the researchers. Sorry for taking so much of your time. I hope we can meet you soon, and we will be in touch in our group to, agree on the next session and the next papers. And I hope I can meet you soon.
Recordings